Healthy soils are essential for achieving broader goals, such as net zero carbon emission, reversing biodiversity loss, and sustaining human health. But to fix our soils, we must first understand them. We need tools to identify quickly the land that is being degraded and needs our attention. Then policymakers can target those areas with policies to promote sustainable land management and farming practices. For this series, we are interviewing some of the leading scientists who are working to create these tools. They are part of the project funded by the European Union called AI for Soil Health. And as the name suggests, they are using artificial intelligence and a range of other cutting-edge innovation to lead the way towards understanding our soils. In this episode, we hear from Emmanuel Arthur, senior researcher at Aarhus University. Hi, Emmanuel. We are here today to understand your work in the AI for Soil Health project. So I would like to ask first, what exactly are indicator selection frameworks for soil health?
We need to understand what an indicator is before we get to the selection framework. So an indicator is anything you would measure normally to tell you something about the physical, chemical, and biological health of a soil. This is the basic definition. And now we also call them descriptors. Depends on who you talk to. So we know that most of the parameters we measure for soil are all important for one thing or the other. So if you tell a soil biologist to measure soil health, they will measure biological indicators. If you tell a soil physicist to measure soil health, they will measure physical indicators. And you can have between 50 and 100 measurements if you want. But the challenge is we don't have money for all of that anyway. So at any point, if you want to know the health of your soil, you think about the cost, you think about how many times you can do it to check it. Then you need to select some of this large group. So the framework is some kind of setup that helps you to choose which of these lots of properties you would measure and be able to give an overall assessment of your soil health. So an indicator selection framework is just a setup or system that helps you to choose some indicators to describe your soil health based on what you want. And that part is important. Depends on what you want out of your assessment, right?
And how do they help us to understand if our soils are healthy or not?
First, it depends on what you want, right? Do you want to know if your soil is good for A or B? After you have decided that, then you would have to have some kind of thresholds or limits or benchmarks. It depends on what you want. And then based on those numbers, with your measurement, you can say, my soil is healthy or not. But that alone is not so interesting because you want to know what happened in the last 10 years, what will happen in the next 10 years. So normally you would measure this now, and that's what is more important. And then 5 years later, you measure again and say, is my soil getting worse or better based on this need I want? And what I mean is, if you want to describe the health of your soil for crop production, it is very different than if you want to use it for filtering water in a neighborhood so that you don't have pollutants in the groundwater. These are two different uses. So if you ask me to assess the health of a soil for crop production, I will come up with a different assessment. And if you ask me to assess the same soil for filtering water, I may come up with a different assessment. So it helps to make these decisions, these selections, and then decide on the health based on what you want.
Okay, and so you're now creating a frameworks for European Union, but what makes challenging then to track soil health across different regions? Because it's a European project,
Yeah.
and for sure different soils means different measures.
Yes, this will be nice and easy. And at a European level, what we want is to be able to come to you and say, you measure A, B, C. If you have 15, it's good. If you have 20, it's bad. But as you said, that's not possible, realistically. Policy-wise, maybe it's easy but usually people would complain because it will be unfair to a lot of people in different places. And why? One of them you already said. Soil is very different in different places. And they are different because of the climate and also because of the source of the soil, the rocks that they are made from. So when you take the same measurement, assuming we have selected our perfect set of indicators with our indicator selection framework, everything is nice. All of us agree that these 10 things or 12 things, as the EU has done now, is what we want. The challenge is that if I go to Spain or Italy and I measure those things in the same field that is managed the same way, like a field in Northern Europe, the numbers will be different. So it will not be because of the management alone, it will be because of the type of soil and the climate. So the challenge comes with how do you then create these thresholds that make sense in Italy and also make sense in Denmark, where it's raining all the time, so you don't have a salinity problem. We in Denmark, we don't do any good thing to have more rain. And people in south of Spain, they don't do any bad thing to have less rain. It's just the way it is. So we need to consider the climate. What do you want to use it for? Even in Italy, do you want to use it for forest, or do you want to use it for cropland, or do you want to use it for, I don't know, restoration projects or something? So that is what makes it challenging. So we want to track soil health, but our approach so far is to look at it in these units. So same climate, same land use, same soil type, at least. And then in that unit, you have some kind of thresholds or some kind of benchmark that you think is good or not for the indicators for that unit. And that unit in Italy might be the same unit in Germany somewhere. So it is not divided according to countries or administrative regions. And then you can use that benchmark to decide if the soil is healthy or not. But once again, at the end of the day at EU level, we want to improve soil. So we just need something to measure now. And in 2030, go back again and say, okay, this was like this 25, and now it is better. I think that's the most important thing. It is not about, is my soil healthy now or not? This is not enough. You need to go on to get some other information. Yes.
And what are some examples of these indicators?
At the EU level, we are almost now in a box, as you say. In the project, we are looking at a lot of indicators. But at the EU level, there's a selection of about 12 indicators now that will be used in the next few years at least. And you have carbon, which everybody agrees that's important for whatever reason. So organic matter or organic carbon, depends. And then we have the amount of nutrient you have. We don't want it excess, so we need to measure whether we have excess nutrients like phosphorus or not. We have pH, we have nitrogen, we have how easy is it for water to go through the soil, so infiltration, and how easy is it for water to stay in the soil, which is the water holding capacity. And then in some areas, we also look at how contaminated is the soil. So what is the level of contaminant in the soil? And then we can also look at how strong the soil is, which is bulk density in this case. Is it easy for plants to grow in it? Is it easy for water to even get inside? And then we also look at how biodiverse the soil is. Do you have a soil that has only earthworms and nothing else? Or it has other things which are necessary for soil health? So those are examples of indicators.
And you're also looking at proxy measures?
Yes.
And what does that mean? And why is it useful to find this in soil health monitoring?
Proxy measures some things you would measure in place of something. That's what proxy means, right? And when we decide on the indicators we want to measure, one of the biggest challenges is the cost, because it's expensive, and also time. So even if you have money, you still need to go to the field, take samples, and then come to the lab and do some measurement that can take months. So we would like to look at other approaches where you can get those indicators in a very fast way without always going to the field. So one of the common techniques that we'll use will be spectroscopy. So instead of going to the field to measure 10 indicators, If you build a very good spectroscopic model, you can take one scan of a sample, and then you can estimate those 10 from that scan. And the good thing is, it means you can scan a lot of samples within a short time compared to if you have to do the measurements in the lab. So that's an example of a proxy measure. One other example we are looking at is enzyme activity. So previously, we did not use so much biological indicators because they take time and a lot of chemicals to measure, and it takes so long in a lab. So one of our partners is developing a device where you can just go to the field, put a sample on it, and then get a measurement of several enzymes at the same time. And that's much faster, maybe 10 times faster compared to if you have to do it in a lab. So yes, those measure the activity, but they are still proxies because we would always prefer the lab where you can put something and see the color changing and everything yourself. And then, for example, if I ask you to tell me how much of Europe is covered with crops, because we know that when you have soil that is not covered with crops, it's not a good idea. So we want to know what is the land cover in Europe. We could go to the field, check how much of this area is covered by crops and how much is empty, or we could just take a satellite image and map how much bare soil you have at which time. So that gives you a proxy measure of land cover, but you are not measuring land cover per se. You are measuring which part of the area looks bare and there's nothing there. And then from that, you can estimate land cover. So those are examples of proxy measures that we would use.
Thank you so much. And talking about the soil health monitoring law, what are your hopes about that?
I think first, it is very good news that we have a soil monitoring law. This is very important because this is something we've been fighting for years. So just the idea that at EU level, we have been able to put in place legislation that is supposed to monitor the soil is very good. That's the first thing. There will be challenges, but it's important to mention that this is good. The second thing is, my hopes is that maybe we should, for once, agree that we cannot have the same criteria for everyone. And this is the most important part of the monitoring, because as an old joke, you cannot compare the ability of a dog and a bird to fly. There's no way, no matter how good you teach the dog, it would always fly worse than a crappy bird, because naturally they are much better. This is the way it is. And the reason I give this example is we cannot have, for example, the same threshold for carbon across Europe, because that would make no sense. I give an example here, which is maybe easy. If we decide that carbon should be 2% to 5%, and if you are within this, you are okay. And if you are less, it's very bad. How do we treat peat soils, which are also in Europe? And if I'm a landowner and you tell me the range is 2 to 5%, and in my land the peat carbon is 40%, and I'm planning to sell the peat until it comes to 10%, and at least I'm still above the 5%, this is still bad. The soil gets worse. So you need to have a different threshold for peat soils, for example, compared to arable soils. And then if I go to Southern Europe, I would need a much lower threshold just because of climate, not because of what they are doing. Same with salt levels or in the north. So I think my hope is that we would look at these either climate units or soil type units or land use and decide what thresholds we will use and what target values we will use or benchmarks we will use. Depends on who is doing the assessment. But at least we should look at those distinctions.
And what is a good example of an indicator framework which has been used to track and manage soil health?
There's one called a Cornell framework. So Cornell University decided that they would look at, I think, 40 or 35 indicators, and then based on, like I described, based on what the farmers want, which type of soil you have, how easy can you measure it? Is it reproducible? How quickly does it change? If you measure a very fancy indicator that changes in 50 years, is stupid because you cannot get any change in 10 years. So based on all those as evaluations and cost, and also for Cornell, they also looked at something interesting. They looked at how easy is it for the farmer or for a stakeholder to understand the measurement. If they don't understand the measurement, it's not very useful. So after all that, they came up with around, I think, 10 out of the 34, and then said these 10 are for this area of the US. And it makes sense. And they have used it over the last, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 10 years or more, and it works quite okay. And the good thing about that framework is that it's also expandable. So if you decide that I use it in the other part of the US and you have two properties or indicators that are very important, it is easy to add it to it and also take out some of them you don't want. So that is a kind of setup we are looking into, that we will build a framework that you can change if you want, also adapt it to different regions of Europe. In some parts of Europe, salt content is so important because it's dry. In Northern Europe, it is completely useless because every time your indicator for salinity will never be lower, right? So it should be expandable to be able to do that. Yeah. So that's an example.
And finally, is there a surprising moment, a surprising finding you had in your research that you think it's useful for the soil health community to share?
I think some of my colleagues, we did some tests of this indicator selection, the framework, and also the assessment of soil health. And then it was working. It looked quite good. We are not finished yet. And then we thought, yes, now we got it. We can use this nice assessment tool we have derived. And then I went to a conference where we had a discussion. And so we had this European map. And someone said, wait, I come from this country. And this part of the map is definitely not correct. You explained the process and everything, but this part of the map in my country, I know this is not correct. And then we all looked at it and said, yeah, it looks a bit strange. And that moment, we had a discussion where we found out that no matter the indicator selection framework you use, no matter the considerations you make, and also the units you arrange and say that we have to select this unit and that unit and everything, the amount of data you put in is the most important thing. Like I said, measurement are expensive. So usually we would always try to do the maps and try to do the health thing with as little data as possible. But we found out that for the same region, if you have 50 samples as an input to your map, or you have 200 samples, your map can look very different. And I think for me, for the soil science community, when we are starting the monitoring law and starting to make these fancy health assessment frameworks and also an index and all that, data is very important. At the start, we need to have as much data as we can. And then later on, you can have those proxies and all that. But without it, we would put in a lot of effort and the outcome will not be very nice. And for monitoring, when you have stakeholders having the reaction that the person had, which was the scientist, so they can understand, right? If a stakeholder starts with, oh, you explained a very fancy thing, but this is not how my farm looks like. On your map, my farm is bad, and I know my farm is very good. And I've done these practices for 20 years. You guys said I should do, and it's good. When you have stakeholders having that reaction at the start of a new thing, they lose interest and they lose trust in it. So I think we should be careful with that. For me, that was very important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. AI for Soil Health is funded by the European Union and has received funds from UK Research and Innovation under the UK government's Horizon Europe funding guarantee. For more information, visit aiforsoilhealth.eu. That is AI for as number soilhealth.eu.